My name is Bill Benson. I have hosted the museum's first person program since it began in 2000. Through these monthly conversations, we bring you firsthand accounts of survival of the Holocaust. Each of our first person guests serves as a volunteer at the museum. We are honored to have Holocaust survivor Estelle Laughlin share her individual personal account of the Holocaust with us. Estelle, thank you so much for joining us today. We are just thrilled that you are our first person. You have so much to share with us, Estelle. So we'll get started. Please tell us about your early life in Warsaw, Poland, to get us started.
I was born in Warsaw, Poland, to a happy middle class family. My father was a jeweler. His workshop was attached to our uh, apartment, and he was always available to me. He taught me to be reflective and kind. My mother was feisty, romantic, and very compassionate, in spite of the fact that she was chased out from a shtetl in Belarus during a pogrom. She still spoke about the Russian people as being a suffering people. Although anti-Semitism, outbursts of anti-Semitism were common in Warsaw, Poland, still Warsaw glows in my selective memory in golden radiance of lilac trees against open blue skies, rich sounds of good neighbors, kindness and trust and love.
And Estelle, you had one sister, is that right?
Right. My how could I have omitted that? She was a year and a half older than I was, and she was my playmate and role model.
Frida.
Free.
Estelle, 82 years ago today, on September 1st, 1939, the Second World War began when Nazi Germany invaded Poland. You were just 10 years old at the time. Please tell us what changed when the German army marched into Warsaw less than a month later, as we see here in this photograph, and their occupation of Warsaw began.
Immediately, my life changed beyond recognition. My once peaceful streets were now patrolled by foreign soldiers. They uh, 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 snapped whips in our homes and streets. They accused us of being greedy, yet they walked into our homes like common thieves and helped themselves to whatever they wanted to. They rationed all food, closed schools, and made books illegal. We had no electricity, no transportation, no telephones, and we couldn't reach friends even in an emergency. Radios were confiscated and newspapers were stopped the same day. We lived in a state of darkness, cut off from the world and everything that was taking place there.
Estelle, please tell us when you were forced to wear a white armband with the blue Star of David, and you
Yeah.
remember that.
Oh, absolutely,
Yeah.
yes. We had to wear an armband with a Star of David as though my religion were an insult.
You've shared with me in the past that children helped by keeping watch for German soldiers. They helped to hide contraband and do other things. Will you say more about that?
Yeah, miraculously and gratefully, children remain children and play in the world of make believe. But children are also very wise, and and they uh, um, uh, they see right from wrong, and and so in time of war and need, children rise to to the occasion. So we used to play in the courtyard or in the streets, but we were also extremely vigilant to look out for a uniform. If we saw a Nazi uniform, we flew like a fury into the building and warned everyone um, uh, Nazis are coming. And not only that, we would run home and help our parents hide contraband, such as white bread and books. And yes, children were extremely vigilant, and children are extremely wise and resilient, and they rise to the occasions.
In October 1940, the Germans established a ghetto in Warsaw and moved all Jewish residents of Warsaw and the surrounding towns into that ghetto, including your family. The 1.3 square mile ghetto was now inhabited by more than 400,000 people and was enclosed and sealed off from the rest of the city. Please tell us about your life in that ghetto.
They built a thick wall around us and filled the ghetto with people driven out, Jewish people driven out from the surrounding area. Most came on foot, often without a penny in their pockets, and often without shoes on their feet. The place was so crowded that approximately like 10 people per room would average. And this, and we had to pay for that wall too. And also there was not enough food, there was not enough shelter, so people died of cold and starvation and illness in the streets. People covered the bodies of dead children with posters saying, "Our children must live. Children are the holiest things."
Estelle, tell us about your father and his love of books.
So in this inferno, some people sometimes ask me, and ask probably other survivors, why didn't you fight back? But we did fight back. There was an immense moral resistance. So to own a book was an act of defiance. And my father, punishable by that, this was a capital crime. And yet, all over the ghetto, people had secret libraries. My father had a stash of his favorite books by Yiddish authors, by Sholem Aleichem, Sholem Asch, and Isaac Peretz. Nights, windows blinded with dark covers to keep our existence secret. My father would pull out his books and read to us. By the we had a flickering carbide light. We had no electricity. Our room felt like a capsule of paradise, separating us from the deadly quiet outside our windows.
Estelle, just to make sure our audience heard you correctly, not only was owning a book an act of defiance, it also meant risking one's life to have a book, which is incredible.
Not only one's life, but the whole families,
The
and
whole families.
or maybe even everyone in the building, and maybe even everyone in the street. The Nazis were very good in keeping people in fear and life. They were demigods. They controlled our lives completely.
And despite that, you've shared with me that there was the ability among those of you in the ghetto still to celebrate holidays and celebrate some form of culture. How did you manage to do that?
That was our form of resistance, our form of holding on to our humanity. Guns hovering over our heads did not stop us from celebrating holidays. We pulled the window shades down and we celebrated. We even had theaters. Imagine theaters when there was no bread. There was a wonderful writer and historian in the ghetto. His name was Chaim Kaplan, and he said, "It is strange that when we don't seem to need it at all, we need poetry more than we need bread. And it is true. I think that our ability to think for ourselves, our ability to create, is our godliness.
Mhm. Still, despite schools being formally closed, of course, did you have the opportunity for any school learning?
We didn't have an opportunity, but we created the opportunity. The
Mhm.
parents said, children above all. Some parents, the food was rationed and very little food was really allowed. Yet some parents traded their bread for tutors uh,
Mhm.
to teach their children. I remember my mother saying, we went to, I'll describe the place where we went for our tutoring. I remember my mother saying to my father, isn't that crazy? We don't know if we'll see another sunrise, and you think of sending them to risk their lives and our lives for tutoring. And my father said, I remember them whispering that, and my father said that maybe the only childhood will be able to give them, and we must risk. So down the street, there was a hidden little house behind tall hedges, and this is where we ran every morning, hiding our books, that whatever we had under our clothes, knowing that if we would be caught, we would be shot and the people we loved would be killed. So we ran into to open that little fence door and walked into that small building and into the room where our wonderful teacher, Pani Marisha, waited for us. The room was bare. There was not a picture in the room. There was not a scrap of teaching materials, just a few children sitting in front of of Pani Marisha. And she held her voice, embraced us, her enthusiasm, everything about her is unforgettable to me. She uh, uh, so had some records that played to us. A few books that she shared with us and made us see in our minds things that did not exist there for us, yet she brought to life, to our imaginations, beauty and love and security. The moments that we were there, we forgot about
Mhm.
our miseries. It was our little paradise.
Mhm.
And this school existed for maybe a year and a half. And
Mhm.
I remember also she found some seeds, and and we planted outside. We found a little soil, and we maybe took stalks of beans, and how proud we were to see the little sprouts. Yes,
Mhm.
so there
Still,
was goodness.
you've mentioned that food was scarce. How did you manage to get food and otherwise survive in those conditions?
Right. So the food was rationed, and uh, I think that we were allowed about 1/10 of the minimum uh, uh, calorie daily requirements. So you could not survive, and a majority of the people, the street was strewn was with corpses. It was so ghoulish. I remember looking at them and saying, "Oh, I don't want to die that way. I don't want my mother or father or my sister or my friends to die that way with nobody crying it was overwhelming. It was littered. In fact, there were carts that would go down the street and collect the corpses. And yet we had books, and yet we had theaters. That's how we held on, and secret school. That's how we held on to our humanity and to meaning.
The
Right.
Nazis started deporting large numbers of Jews out of the Warsaw Ghetto to the Treblinka Killing Center in July 1942. For a period of time, your family was able to avoid deportation. Tell us how that was possible. How did you avoid that?
In July 1942, the month of my 13th birthday, things became even worse, more horrid. This was the start of the Warsaw Ghetto deportations. We had no idea that the deportations meant death. Some people were forced to write false letters inviting families and friends to places where they were fed and clad and sheltered. So, of course, some destitute people went willingly and unknowingly to their death, but many hid. We lived in apartment buildings. Where does one hide in an apartment building? We hid in cupboards, hid in drawers, in closets, behind chairs, between mattresses and box springs. My family and some other people designated one room or selected one room and put a wardrobe in front of the door. And everyone in our apartment building who lived in the same row of apartments obscured the same door not to give away the secret. So we hid behind in the secret room. While we were in hiding, the deportations proceeded with 20th century know-how and Stone Age values. Between mid-July 1942 and September, in less than 2 months, 99% of the children disappeared. My sister and I were among the 1% that survived. Can you imagine a world without the sound of children,
No.
without grandparents, because old people and children were the first to be killed? We never heard from the people who were wrenched from us. But a few managed to come back under the cover of night and told us about the horrendous train rides to a place called Treblinka, where our people were guests. I cannot imagine how anyone who loves their wives and children and mothers could do such a thing. This is why I am telling the story that is so hard to listen to and so hard to talk about, because it generates such pain. And I believe this is why the the audience is listening here today, because we need to be reminded from time to time that human beings are capable of great cruelty. And in seeing that and recognizing that, appreciates so much more the value of life. The world is one family. If the dignity of any human being is tarnished, all of humanity is diminished.
Estelle, as you said, the deportations began in July 1942. In less than 2 months, by September of 1942, three-quarters of the population, the Jewish population of Warsaw, had been deported, from 400,000 down to about 100,000. But you, fortunately, you and your sister and your mother and father survived that. In 1943, you began to work in a German factory. Tell us about going to work in the factory, how that was possible. You were what, 13 years of age at the time?
So as soon as the people that remained, by then there were very few people left in the ghetto. As soon as the people, the surviving people in the Warsaw ghetto heard about Treblinka, they began to organize themselves into armed resistance. My father was a member of the armed resistance, and the resistance fighters began to build bunkers in basements, and we moved from our second floor apartment to a ground floor because we were the only people still alive in our building, so it was no problem to find a place on the ground floor, and we too had a bunker.
Still,
And also the freedom, the resistance fighters dug tunnels for navigation between the bunkers, and also to get under the wall to the Christian side, to get from the Polish people, from the Polish underground arms, and they also used the sewers a great deal. There was a lot of navigation using the sewers.
Still, before we turn to the full fury of the Warsaw Uprising, you went to work in this factory.
Right.
Tell us how that came about and what you were doing.
Right. So most of the people were deported. The buildings were empty. There were so few people. If I would walk out from our courtyard to stick my head out to hear the familiar voice, all I could feel was silence. The silence was palpable. So only a small group of people was allowed to remain in three different streets. The rest of the ghetto was vacant, and the people, only those people who were lucky enough to find employment in one of the German factories was allowed to live. They were defined as useful. All the others were condemned to die. They were useless. We called them the wild people, and there were quite a few among us who were there. They were wild people, unofficial. My mother, sister, and I had worked in a factory mending Nazi uniforms. My father was also among the wild ones.
Wild. Mm-hmm.
Right, and so they were busy getting ready for resistance if deportations would occur again.
Now it's April 1943 when German forces entered the ghetto to begin deporting the remaining inhabitants. In response, Jewish resistance fighters fought back in what is known as the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. So tell us about what happened to you and your family. You had the chance to say a little bit about the work that was going on underground, literally, to prepare for the resistance. What did this mean for you and your family, your mother, your father, your sister, and you?
Well, events erupted with Nazi columns marching into the ghetto with armored cars and tanks and bomber planes over above us, and we had a bunker, as I mentioned. So we opened the trap door, the secret trap door, stepped down the flimsy ladder into the bunker, pulled the trap door down. I felt banished.
Mm-hmm. This is not a photograph of your bunker, but
Right.
Tell us about this.
Well, the ceiling pressed down on me, the damp walls closed me in, the flickering of the carbide light was our substitute for the sun. The ticking of the clock was our only clue when morning was rising and night was setting. The few people who shared the bunker with us was my whole nation. How I missed the open horizon, the blue crispness of day. And while we were in this netherworld, fighting broke out in the streets, facing a 20th century army armed from head to toe, facing armored cars and tanks and bomber uh, uh, planes was a handful of uh, of poorly clad, poorly fed, poorly armed freedom fighters. They climbed out from the tunnels, climbed up on rooftops in front of open windows, in front of tanks, and lobbed Molotov cocktails and whatever else they had, very little, of course. It is noteworthy, Bill, that it took that handful of freedom fighters longer to battle than it took for Poland or for France to capitulate.
Estelle, as you've described, this poorly armed, poorly clad, poorly fed, as you said, group of resistance fighters held off the German army for nearly a month. But eventually, of course, the Germans began to accelerate their efforts and began to destroy the ghetto, literally building by building. And eventually they got to your building. What happened to you?
Well, at some point, a grenade was thrown into our bunker, and there was not a corner to hide anymore. In an instant, a horde of barbarians were upon us, and they chased us out into the street. The ground beneath us trembled. The air thundered with detonations. Flames, enormous bomber planes, warplanes were dropping incendiary bombs. Flames, enormous tongues of flames, were licking the sky and painting it in otherworldly colors of iridescence. And they marched us, our lips were parched from thirst and dust, and the people in congealed blood. Amazing how much suffering human beings can take and remain human and compassionate. And they marched us to uh, freight to the deportation station.
Estelle, tell us about your arrival at Majdanek and what that meant.
Uh, when we arrived at Majdanek, they separated women, men, and children. There were very few children. The children were isolated in a barbed wire area, and they yammered, "Mama, Tat, I was so afraid that because children under 14 were contraband and I was 13." That they would separate me from my mother and sister. So the women were seated together on the ground, waiting for orders. We expected the next order would be to go to the showers. And the men were sitting across in a group across from the women. And there was a small space where the guards were marching back and forth and keeping us in fear. My father wiggled his way to sit in the first row uh, and locked eyes with us. His eyes, I was so used to looking into his eyes for comfort and reassurance. They were so full of suffering, I could hardly bear it. When the guard wasn't looking, I dashed across that divide and knelt in front of my father. And I said, "Tata, don't worry about me. They won't get me." I turned the lapel of my jacket and showed him that we had cyanide thrown in our lapels as a last resort. And I said, Dad, I remember I have cyanide. He looked at me and he said, no, you must live. And I lived.
Still, that was the last time you saw your father. Um,
That was the last time I saw my father. But he lives in me. The voice, his voice, he left in me. It's an eternal voice of goodness and kindness. And that too was a way of holding on to our humanity. It's the faith that there is good and kind.
Estelle, if you don't mind, you had a photograph of your father after he was gone. Tell us what happened to that photograph.
I had a photograph of my father. My father was extremely dear to me. And so I hid the photograph. The only thing I held on was between under the lining of my shoe, where that little lining that covers the sole of the shoe. So I put it under that lining, and so the soldier stopped me and he said, "What are you hiding?" I said, "I'm not hiding anything." He says, "You're lying. I know you're hiding something." So I thought, the picture is meaningless to him. I might as well tell him that's all I have. And I showed him the photograph. I said, "Yes, I have. All I have is a photograph of my father." So he snapped it away from me.
Just for the sheer act of the brutality of taking that from you. Estelle, with your father gone, now it's you, your mother, and your sister Frida, and you were selected for forced labor. What Once that happened, what was the daily life like for you and your mother and your sister?
Uh, we worked from pre-dawn to late night. We worked in a ammunition factory. Um, uh, we were starving. There was a small distinction between uh, slave labor camps and extermination camps. Majdanek was an extermination camp, which was purely a killing factory in the 20th century. And a slave labor camp. The camp too was enclosed by electrified barbed wire fences. The electrified barbed wire fence was the end of our horizon, except there was not a crematorium, but they worked us nearly to death. We completely isolated. The camp was surrounded by a vast no man's land, so we were completely isolated. It was impossible to imagine that only a few rabbit hops away from us, people sailed on silver lakes and children sat around dinner tables with families as children should. We had no idea if the Allies were winning or losing. So the only thing that stands out in my mind like a breath of air was when we were marched at gunpoint from the factory to the barracks was a patch of sky. The patch of sky was our only contact with humanity, not really, but with freedom, light.
Still, after you'd been in Majdanek for 3 months, there was an incident with your sister, and tell us about that, how you were able to stay together.
The incident with my sister was kind of complicated, and I'll point out that more of it is in the book that I wrote, Transcending Darkness. It was a very interesting and horrid situation, but something led my sister to be placed on a list that was made public, put on the wall. We were absolutely sure that everyone who was placed on the list was designated for the guest chamber. My mother, sister, and I had a pact that if one of us is sent to the guest chambers, we'll all go. So the only logical thing for my mother and me to do was to trade places with two other women who also were on the list and who hoped to see another sunrise. So the following day, when the three names were called, there were more people, but the three names, my sister and the two women's names that we traded place with, were called. We reported, absolutely sure, beyond any grain of doubt, that we were being marched to the crematorium. Instead, they marched us to a train, and they took us to the camp in Skaržisko.
And this what was it? What were the conditions like for you in Skaržisko?
We worked from early morning till late. And in Majdanek, there was no, and I may have not followed or in Majdanek that we did slave work. We just dug up turf from one place and replaced it in another place, and then
Completely meaningless work.
sadistic, meaningless work. In Skaržisko, as I pointed out, we worked in a ammunition factory from sunrise to sunset, and as I described, there was also an electrified barbed wire fence and towers with sentries who were watching with beams of light every step we went. And we slept in barracks on one plank, maybe 20 or more women squished together like sardines. We had no blankets, no mattresses. We were covered with lice. I don't remember having a comb or a towel.
Still, from Skaržisko, you were forced to move again in the summer of 1944 to another labor camp at Czestochowa. And from there, you would end up being liberated in January 1945. Tell us about the night that you were liberated.
So one night, a miracle happens. We hear a bombardment, and this was January 1945, and from September 1939 to January 1945, we were so completely isolated and had no idea whether Allies are winning or losing. And then we hear that rumble of detonations and heavy artillery. And every time the bombardment paused, we said, oh, please don't stop. Dying by Allied bombs would be such a dignified death. And that night, we were liberated. Our euphoria and our fear and our helplessness, we were liberated by the Russian army. are indescribable. We we this was January 1945.
Bitterly cold, bitterly cold. Yep.
Yeah, Poland is very cold. The ground is covered with snow and ice. All we had on is a loose kaftan, no underwear, no stockings, no scarves, and just a kaftan and wooden clogs, covered with lice and mange, looking so dreadful. And we were so afraid. We wanted to run. This was the front line. What if the Germans uh, move, come back?
Come back. Yeah.
We wanted to run, but we just couldn't. We just shuffled out of the camp, afraid. In fact, we thought maybe it's a ruse. We couldn't believe it. The thought of this being a ruse was ridiculous, but we were so afraid to believe it. And so we shuffled through the no man's land that encircled the camp. And then we hear Russian voices, and we hear tanks and Russian voices. So we rush to them, oh, as though we see Messiah. And we said, oh, do you know how long we've been waiting for you? Oh, with such gratitude. And they held up a hand and they said, sorry, we still have a war to fight. And indeed they did. The war didn't start, wasn't over till May. And they looked at their watches and they told us that it's still war, and that the curfew is still in effect, and that we better find a place before nightfall. I don't know if I was more afraid of dying of cold in the street than being arrested for breaking the curfew and be thrown into jail. So we shuffled forward. No place to go, not a penny, not a home to return to. Warsaw was completely destroyed. Homeless, penniless, and stateless. And we shuffle like that, and nobody, and people look at us and they draw away from us. So nobody wanted to have anything to do with the Jews from concentration camp. And yes, I'm sorry.
Still, I know we're now going to we're going to skip over so much more that you endured with your mother and your sister, although fortunately we were able to stay together. Following your liberation, the three of you together would make your way in an incredible journey through Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Germany, and eventually were able to immigrate to the United States in 1947. These were your documents that you came with to the United States, and we have one more after this one just to show our audience.
Yeah.
Estelle, I have one more question for you in the time that we have left. In the face of rising global anti-Semitism, please tell us why you continue to share your firsthand account of what you experienced during the Holocaust, knowing how painful this is.
I am sharing my experiences with the hope that it will serve as a reminder of the consequences to us and to humanity when we accommodate ourselves to tyrants, how it corrupts the conscience of a nation, what it does to love, what it does to trust. The purpose here is not to curse the darkness of the past, but to illuminate the future. I would like to add that we survived with love for humanity and compassion and joy of life. Life should be lived joyfully. Without that, survival would be hardly meaningful.
And I think everybody viewing today knows that you've just stated what what you are, who you are, and what an honor for us to have you with us today.